Hi, this is Catherine. This is Taking Tea with Catherine. This is such a springy kind of beautiful mug that I got from Anthropology recently. I'm drinking Jane's Garden today, which is a very nice green tea with flavor. A flavored green tea, if you will. And it is something I really like. I like everything about it. But I have to say, the very first green tea I ever drank was a sencha, plain as it were green tea. Um, and I loved it. I love the grassiness, but I've also known some people who said, I don't like plain green tea, I like flavored green tea, and perhaps if they would have started with sencha or something like that, or even a matcha, they may have said, no, this isn't for me. So how do I know how to introduce certain people to certain teas? It really is a bit of a question for me. That kind of brings me into my kind of bookish discussion today, which is also about what book in someone's body of work should a reader be introduced to? And does it matter? Does it sometimes matter? Does it sometimes not matter? And am I going to try to use the word oeuvre? No. I will say body of work, or their collected works, or whatever. So this came up in my mind. Well, I think it's something I thought of before, but I thought about talking about it when I did yet another visit to Book Off, and yes, a haul is coming, you know. But anyway, yeah, it was quite a book buying day that day, and I didn't buy too many books at Book Off, but one of the ones that I looked at and said, was this book, Mark Twain, Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, which obviously he's not personally recollecting Joan of Arc. He was, he wrote an historical fiction book that I think is someone else's recollections on Joan of Arc. And I found this in the biography section, which was, obviously not in the right section. But I had a few reasons why I picked it up. One is I gathered pretty quickly, I think I might have even searched quickly on my phone, that it was historical fiction, and I love historical fiction. Number two, it was $1. If you haven't watched this channel, Book Off is a great bookshop. They have them in different places, but the closest one to me is in Midtown Manhattan. And they, among other things, they have a whole section of $1 books that is actually usually pretty good. And it's worth the risk. So sometimes there are books that you won't like no matter what. But sometimes there's a book that you're not sure, should I get this? But then you get it and you're like, you know what? It was worth taking a chance on. Even if I don't like this book. It was only $1. So that's kind of what happened to me today. Not today. A couple weeks ago, whenever it was I got this book. I thought, I don't really like Mark Twain. I have read, in school I read, I think Tom Sawyer, but I might have also read Huckleberry Finn at some point. And all I knew is I didn't really like it. I didn't hate the writing itself. I just wasn't interested. That's more the word. I just wasn't interested in him. And that became further of a problem for me later on because I had read a quote that he had made about Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, and it was just, maybe he was being a little bit, I don't know, silly or whatever, but to me, it upset me. And also because he went through a little of a, Shakespeare might not have written Shakespeare's things, even though it's a fun kind of almost conspiracy theory to write about, or to read about, sometimes it just annoys me, because I'm like, sorry, drop something. I was thinking if I wrote a lot of very well received writings and someone said years later that I didn't write it, I'd be kind of upset about it, and Mark Twain should have known that. But anyway, and it was not even that I was, okay, I'll never read Mark Twain, it was just I have so many other people I want to read before I read him, so. But this kind of made me think, and I was like, is this going to be my gateway back to Mark Twain? And isn't that a weird way to get to Mark Twain? And does that make sense? Would I try to get someone into reading Mark Twain? Like, let's just say that I end up really loving this book, which we don't know. What if this was a way I could introduce someone to Mark Twain and they end up loving it? Is that weird? A bit of a backdoor kind of situation? I don't know. So, in this, I'm probably mostly going to be talking about classic works, classic novelists, etc. A little bit of nonfiction might come in. Anthony Trollope is someone that could merit a whole discussion. He writes series as well as standalone, so we're not going to get into Trollope today, much as I love to talk about him. And I'm not going to talk about a lot of modern books, really, and especially not series, because that's a different discussion. But that's for another time. So yeah, what does it matter? Which book that we start with in a writer's body of work? Like, what if you start with a bad book? Is that going to be bad? And what constitutes a bad book? See what I mean? So I'm going to use some examples of my personal reading experiences and recommending experiences just to get into it a little bit. So, Jane Austen. I have mentioned before that I started with Emma, which is of her 6 main bodies of work. Her 6 main novels is probably my least favorite, and I still recommend it and think it's fantastic. So that just goes to show how very biased I am about Jane Austen. Although I can argue that I just am among many other people who love her no matter what. I was in a book club, and I don't know, 5-6 years ago, I can't remember when it was, that it was going to be my turn to host. And the book that I recommended turned out to be Persuasion by Jane Austen, because I loved Persuasion so much. It's not a long book, and I figured it might be a great way for people to get to know Jane Austen, because it's not too big of a commitment, and it's a beautiful story, and I love it. So I want to do that. So, everybody met at my place. Unsurprisingly, we set up a kind of afternoon tea situation, and that was pretty good. And most of the people there did not read Persuasion, or they barely read it, or they didn't finish it because it was too hard, the language. And I was like, it was so sad for me. But I was also like, well, that's your taste. That's just how it's going to be. But I almost took it personally and tried not to. But then I thought to myself later on, what would have happened if I would have suggested Pride and Prejudice? Because Pride and Prejudice, unless you're Mark Twain or some other people and you just don't like Jane Austen's writings at all, most people will like Pride and Prejudice. Even if it's not their favorite Jane Austen, they will like Pride and Prejudice. But Pride and Prejudice is so popular in the world of Jane Austen and elsewhere that I think that, even, who was it? Helene Hanff, who was not really into novels that much, loved Pride and Prejudice. So, so I wonder if that was my mistake. It was because I did not introduce them to the right one, the right book. But then again, I talked to my sister about this very subject, and she's a great reader, and she has very good taste in reading. I'm not just saying that because she is my sister, but she does. She has very good taste in reading, and she started Jane Austen with Persuasion, and she still loves it, so I don't know. And then there's Charlotte Bronte. I know, always got to pit them against each other. I'm not really pitting them against each other, though. But I started her with what I thought was her book, and it kind of wasn't, because it was said to be by Charlotte Bronte, but it was actually a story of hers that she didn't finish, and someone else picked it up and named it Emma by Charlotte Bronte. I can't find this book anywhere. People are telling me that this is not real, that I'm imagining this book, but I know there's someone out there who has heard of this, and if you are one of those people, please comment, because it wasn't a bad book, and I just don't know what happened to it anyway, and it wasn't quite the way Charlotte Bronte wrote. Like, it wasn't her typical. But nevertheless, I carried on, and I read Villette not too long after that. And I liked it. And I still would think, I haven't read it in many years, but if I reread it, I'm pretty sure I would like it. And that's fine. But then I realized that I had to return to Charlotte Bronte after many years. And surprisingly, I hadn't, except for reading some juvenilia and some, biographies and stuff like that, that mentioned her, stuff like that, and poetry, I don't know. Personally, by the way, speaking of Brontes, I prefer Emily Bronte's poetry to Wuthering Heights, but anyway. So, I mentioned when I was doing last year, my ill-fated trip to London, that I was going to try to read Shirley, because I had a book that I could just throw away, and I figured if I don't finish it, I could just pick up my other copy of Shirley when I get home, whatever. But then I mentioned later, because I didn't end up taking that trip, I wonder why, that I guess in Victober, which is Victorian reading Victorian novels in October, fun month, I plan to read Shirley and Jane Eyre, and I know at some point in mentioning these things, someone was surprised in the comment section that I had never read Jane Eyre. I knew a lot about Jane Eyre. I'd read the story in a graphic novel. I had seen an adaptation, the one with I think Timothy Dalton. It was okay. And I knew everybody swears by Jane Eyre, and I did end up loving it. And it may end up being my favorite, although I have to read Villette. But did it matter? I mean, I still liked Charlotte Bronte. I still recommended her to everybody, despite not having read Jane Eyre first. And but what if I had read The Professor first? Everybody seems to think that that's her weakest novel. I haven't read The Professor yet. I intend to, hopefully this year, because I just kind of want to. That's the last one of all the major Bronte novels, not counting Emma, that I haven't read. So it's time. But it's different if you read it last and you're like, well, yeah, that wasn't her greatest. Or, well, it's better than I thought it would be. I don't know. So, we'll see. There's a late Victorian writer, early Edwardian writer, who I also talk about often, Arthur Conan Doyle. I have not read his, was it Professor Challenger series? But I have a friend of mine who swears by Professor Challenger, loves those books, and hasn't read Sherlock Holmes. I mean, is it possible that that his historical novels or his other fantasy-ish novels are even better? Who knows? I mean, in terms of to somebody else's point of view, right? But would I start, if I was going to recommend Sherlock Holmes to someone who hasn't read him before, would I start with the first one he wrote, A Study in Scarlet? I did not really like A Study in Scarlet very much. I mean, I didn't hate it, but it kind of just suddenly changes scene and place, and it seemed a little bit I don't know, it just took me out of the enjoyment of like what turned into an okay novel but not a perfect one. And don't get me started on Valley of Fear. But if I gave someone Hound of the Baskervilles, The Sign of Four, Sign of the or of Four, doesn't matter, or the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, like the collection of short stories, which I think are probably my favorite of the Sherlock Holmes stories, because they're just so well done in short story form. But would it matter? I mean, in history, people read, in its time, people read the first one first, and they kept going with Sherlock Holmes, I guess. Maybe. So, now there's another one, Dickens, right? I mean, there's no way of saying this is the quintessential novel to start with Dickens, because it really does depend on taste. Austen, you can argue, all right, maybe not Persuasion, maybe Pride and Prejudice, but maybe Emma, right? Maybe Sense and Sensibility, but most people wouldn't recommend Mansfield Park first, even if some people end up saying it's their favorite. You probably wouldn't recommend that first to somebody, right? But Dickens, right? There are so many. I started in school with A Christmas Carol, and that was just assigned to me, and I didn't mind it. I was fine with it, as far as a story. And then years later, I tried to read Hard Times, and my famous joke of I had a hard time reading that. And then later on, I started reading other of his books. I think the next one I got into was Nicholas Nickleby, which not everyone loves. And I like Great Expectation. Not everyone loves it. Some people swear by A Tale of Two Cities. Some people say, no, you gotta read Bleak House. No, you have to read Oliver Twist, which, no thank you for me. And yet, no one that I have ever heard, read, met, has ever said start with Martin Chuzzlewit. So, does it matter with Dickens? What if someone was sitting somewhere and they had a copy of Martin Chuzzlewit and they said, let me pick this up? Would that be a thing that you say, no, don't do that, don't do that? Speaking of school, as I was briefly speaking of school, I read Animal Farm by George Orwell in school, and it was okay. But I didn't feel after reading that I wanted to read anything else by George Orwell. But then I heard references to some of his essays, particularly the one about tea, because who are we talking about here? Right? And so I read that. I got a hold of a book of his essays, and I'm not saying every essay I loved, but I really did enjoy reading those essays. You know? And then I wanted to read more of his. I still haven't read 1984. I do intend to at some point. I read Down and Out in Paris and London. I thought it was pretty good. And I have other ones of his that I want to read. So that was my way of getting into him. But that's not even a novel. That's a collection of essays. Same thing with Virginia Woolf. I started reading To the Lighthouse, and I never finished it, but I did pick up a copy so that one day I could return to it. And then I realized, let me read Mrs. Dalloway, because that's the most well-known, I think, of her novels, and I really liked it. Not everyone I know would, but I also like her, what's it called? Sort of essays, writings, nonfiction writings, based on experiences, etc., like A Room of One's Own. I absolutely love that. But would I tell someone, how do I get started with Virginia Woolf? Would that be the one I'd hand to them? Well, and that brings up another thing. Does age affect it? Does circumstances affect it? When I say it, I mean which order of books one should read works in. And I think, yeah, it does sometimes matter. And, for instance, A Room of One's Own. That's what it's called, right? Anyway, that might appeal more to women, or female, or whatever you want to call it. And because of the experience, it's a very kind of almost feminist writing. And I'm not saying that a male couldn't enjoy it, but it just brings up a lot, for the female consciousness or whatever. So if I saw two people sitting together and they're both asking me, which Virginia Woolf should I read? Would I say, oh, well, you're a male, so I'm not going to say A Room of One's Own, but you are a female, so I'm going, and age is kind of important too, because I read books by Thomas Hardy and George Eliot that now I realize were quite tragic in what happened and the circumstances. Tessa, the D'Urbervilles, right? But at the time, I really did like those books, even if they were sad. I really liked them. I was in my late teens, at the end of the grunge era in the 90s, and I was moody and still questioning my life and everything, how it is as a teenager, and that was ideal for me at the time. That's what I wanted to get wrapped up in. I liked Romeo and Juliet more when I was younger, because even though now I look at it and say, ugh, it's not romantic at all. Ugh, it's too young teenagers, very young, spending a couple days together. Although it's still, I think, a great piece of writing, but if I were now to be introduced to Shakespeare, I probably wouldn't want Romeo and Juliet to be my first book. I probably want one of the histories, because I love history so much. And that kind of goes into things too. Circumstances, interests. Some people would like to read historical fiction by Mark Twain because that's what they're into. And some people would rather read Tom Sawyer, which nowadays could almost be historical fiction. Anything written in the past. Not really, but you know what I mean. That's another thought. I really know so little about Mark Twain, so I'm not gonna go into that too much, because I know I'll get quite corrected. But that's the point. It is sometimes what someone's in the mood for, what someone's, when I say circumstances, it can be where you're from too, because some classic writers wrote some amazing works, and then one or two of their books said something quite negative about a certain group of people, that a person belonging to that group of people might read that book and say, oh, I can't read anymore by this writer. They're terrible. They're horrible. They're horrible people. So that could matter too. And opinion matters. I when I started to get back into Agatha Christie again, I know I'd read a bunch of, what was it, Miss Marple years ago, but I started by reading Poirot again, well, maybe for the first time, and I started with his first book. But would I recommend that first book? I thought it was fantastic, so I probably would. But maybe I'd want to say, Murder on the Orient Express, because that is such a widely received, loved book of Agatha Christie's that might be where I started. But I know other people who like cozy mysteries more and like that whole English country village feeling. And I'd probably say, well, Miss Marple then. So sometimes it depends, and I don't know if there is a wrong or right in these situations. But some people will be very adamant about certain writers, and you have to start with this. You must start, no matter who you are, you must start with that. So this is where I'm opening it up to discussion. In the comments, if you have anything to say, I would love to hear your opinions. And if you are a booktuber and you would like to discuss this more, I wouldn't mind doing a discussion video about that as well, because there's so much more. I only did the tip of the iceberg with classic novels. I barely talked about classic novels as it is. I barely got out of Victorian era. So there are so many more examples to get into. So this is an open invitation, as it were. Did I say as it were again? I sure did. Drink a sip of tea every time I say as it were. If you will. So anyway, that's all for now. If you like these kind of discussions, or if you like talking about classics, mysteries, history, nonfiction of many different kinds, and some types of fiction, obviously, and you like to talk about tea, and you maybe like to talk about cats, which my cats are quite ignoring me today, so maybe not. Then please subscribe, and that's all for today. This is Catherine taking tea with Catherine. Have a lovely tea and book-filled day.